Hey there, internet friends, and welcome to another episode of That Nerdy Site Show, a weekly podcast where the team members from That Nerdy Site get together to talk about our lives and all of the nerdy things we love about them. I'm your host, Trevor Starkey, and joining me this week, Logan Wilkinson. How you doing, Logan?
I am doing fantastic. How are you doing, Trevor?
Doing all right. We sat down, recorded our normal episode yesterday, had a good long conversation on stuff like Raya and the Last Dragon and War for Wakanda and stuff. And then we realized, oh, hey, we've still got like the end of the month. So this is our Patreon early access episode for it'll be going up the end of August. If you're unfamiliar with this is every month we do kind of a bonus episode of That Nerdy Site Show that is less about the things we've been playing or watching or whatever, and more about let's just like focus in on like a single topic. We put those up for our Patreon supporters at the $1 or above level. They get early access to that for a month, and then it goes live the following month for anybody else. So today it's gonna be a little bit of a weird one because we're essentially doing like an epilogue to one of our other podcasts, That D Plus Show.
Yeah.
Because today we're going to be talking all about kind of the recent Summer of Star Wars thing that we did. Logan wasn't able to join us for the final episode on our Summer of Star Wars, so we're going to kind of, he and I sit down and get his Star Wars thoughts, wrap up thoughts that we kind of covered in that show, as well as like his thoughts on the Empire of Dreams documentary that we watched to wrap it up, and just what it was like kind of spending a summer with Star Wars. And kind of give the meta, like how it felt to do it on the content side of things. So we will dive into that in a little bit, but before we do, a little bit of quick housekeeping for you. If you like what you hear, please remember to like, subscribe, rate, review, share the podcast with your friends, all that fun stuff. And if you're feeling extra generous and you are not already supporting us on Patreon, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/thatnerdysite, just like our wonderful Patreon producers do, Pam Larson, Sherry Starkey, and Teresa Wilkinson. Let's hop right on in. I guess first place to go, Logan, since we didn't have you on Saturday or on this last Friday's episode of That D Plus Show, where we talked about the Empire of Dreams documentary about the making of the original trilogy. Let's start right there. What were your thoughts on that documentary? This is something you'd watched a lot previously. It was one of my first times watching it. I'm sure I'd seen clips and anecdotes and stuff here and there from it, but this is probably my first time sitting through the entire thing. But it was something that like you and Cameron in particular had like really hyped up to me a lot over last couple of years and stuff, since Disney Plus became a thing. So what was it like for you going back and rewatching this, and then your just kind of general thoughts on the documentary?
Yeah, I really like Empire of Dreams. I think for me it is kind of a holocron, if you will, use a Star Wars metaphor, of so much of like information that I would pull from and expand on over the ensuing years, right? Because the documentary came out when, I was 11 or 12. And so I was kind of beginning to get into that age of going from like learning a lot about the lore of the Star Wars universe to learning about like the behind the scenes nature and like the fact these are like films kind of thing. And so this was one of the first stepping stones in that process of like learning behind the scenes drama or controversies, or just how kind of incredible it is that these movies even exist to some degree. And then I think for me, as someone who's always loved George Lucas, right, who's never really gotten a lot of the George Lucas hate, certainly not the level of hate that he received 99 to like 17, 18, once the sequels came out, that hate kind of died down quite a bit, I feel like. People put back on their rose-tinted glasses. But as someone who's never really hated him, who's always kind of been like, I like George Lucas, I'm glad that he gave me this thing that I love. I thought it was cool to see the human side of him, right? And like the flaws that are there and not. I think a lot of the stories are still super interesting, right? We talked about this off air yesterday, but I mean, the movie doesn't focus that much on Return of the Jedi, which is my favorite movie, which is sort of unfortunate. But I think the stuff you get for A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back is really cool, right? And like one of my favorite stories that me and Cameron, I think, like referenced at the time when we did the Empire Strikes Back podcast is how isolated and alone Mark Hamill is. Like the entire movie, like he's just like off on a set with like no one else there basically except for the crew, and there's like a distance there even to like it's just Mark Hamill slowly going nuts on Empire Strikes Back, which I just find is a really cool like kind of subplot to like that movie and kind of his performance in it. And so I mean I think Star Wars is a completely ridiculous thing, and it almost certainly shouldn't have ever existed, right? And like that I think is just cool to kind of get the full scope of like, you know, growing up, we were, even in the 90s, we were so immersed in Star Wars everywhere, right? Like it was just like it had become so ingrained in like pop culture, and it had become so a part of like, you know, the consciousness of, you know, media, even in the 90s, even before the prequel trilogy and the sequel trilogy after that. And so to kind of be reminded that this wasn't always this pop culture behemoth, right? And it was something that was a very scrappily done production where like they couldn't even edit out a guy hitting his head on a, you know, door. Like that made it in, right? And how like by the seat of their pants it all was, and how limited its release was initially, right? And I think it is sort of bizarre to look back at that period in time, right? Because yesterday we talked a little bit about how American Graffiti ended up being like the second or third biggest movie the year it came out.
Third, yeah.
Which is like crazy to think about because movies were different back then, right? Like the third biggest movie in the year doesn't mean the same thing as it does now, right? And so in so many ways, Star Wars completely transformed movies. That and Jaws, which came out before it, like they basically invented a blockbuster movie in a lot of ways. And so it is this weird thing to like look back at like what the world of 1977 looked like in 1980 as it kind of slowly began to be changed into the more modern thing. And to where like by 1983 they had to like have like a fake name for the movie because it was such a huge deal by the time like Return of the Jedi was coming out. And so yeah, like I think it's cool to get those stories, right? Like, do we know a lot of them now in 2021? Sure. Is that partially because of this documentary and like all of the books that have come out about Star Wars? Yeah, but it's still cool to get, you know, the principal actors and directors and writers kind of talk about it in their own words, right, on camera. I still think is neat. You know, it's not the greatest documentary ever made, but I think it's one that is really neat. And just like in the same way that you kind of touched on, I think it's really cool to have ended the summer of Star Wars with Empire of Dreams and bring it back to the original trilogy where it all began, both on our podcast and obviously with the series, and kind of be reminded of like how different they just felt, both on a production level and on a like storytelling level, right? Like one of the big things for me, and this is kind of like taking your question and then like merging it into a new like thing, but like one of the cool things for me of like watching all of Star Wars has been that core idea that we keep talking about, which is like the history of the series and how much it revolves around the original trilogy, right? That is like the sun that everything else revolves around is the original trilogy, no matter what sort of media they kind of take it from there. And the movies that I think are most successful, the ones that most get what made those movies special, and whether that is Rogue One for me, or Force Awakens, whether that's The Last Jedi for you, it is these movies that I think get what made this special and then do their own versions of it or do their own kind of iterations on it or subvert it, right, in Last Jedi's case. And I think the movies that are the least successful don't really understand what made the original trilogy special, and I think that's a lot of the prequel trilogy and a not insignificant amount of the sequel trilogy, right? I think it's been really interesting watching all these different versions of Star Wars and all these different versions of these characters and these stories and these worlds, right? And this might partially be because like I'm playing Fallen Order as well, which you talked about. When you listen to this like a day ago or a month ago, but I think one of the last things I'll say on this that I will bring back up later, I'm going to get to the rankings, is Star Wars the original trilogy is super weird. Like there's nothing really like it, like in any other movie or franchise like nothing's really like it. And I mean that both in the really broad ways of like, it's a bizarre trilogy of films that just really works somehow, but also because like it's very clearly based off of Joseph Campbell, right, and the hero of A Million Faces and all this kind of stuff. But George Lucas, I think, is cleverer than a lot of people give him credit for, and maybe not necessarily in terms of like dialogue writing, but in terms of doing that and subverting a lot of those tropes and subverting a lot of those kind of ideas and doing his own twist in them, right? And this blending together of genres, right? Because I was trying to talk to Shravia a week ago about like Star Wars and like what makes it so different, right? And it is the fact that it like Star Wars isn't really a science fiction series, and a lot of the times I think its weakest is actually when it tries to be like too sci-fi and to like explain everything, and that's when I think it kind of falls apart. Like Star Wars is a Western, and it's a samurai film, and it's an action adventure, and it's a pulp like 1930s like comic strip. Like it's all these, and it's a B movie, and it puts all these things together and somehow makes really great movies or really bad movies, but movies that are really distinct from like anything else, right? Like it's not a sci-fi genre film in so many ways, and so it was cool to kind of watch Empire of Dreams again and kind of get that mind of like, oh right, like this is not a typical movie series, but even like typical sci-fi thing within its own genre that I feel like it's come to define, but in a lot of ways it kind of shouldn't, because it's very different than a lot of the other sci-fi films.
Yeah, it was definitely interesting, and since you weren't able to join us, I'll just kind of like go over a couple of like the beats that I may have already covered in that, but then one that I didn't definitely, but you mentioning it reminded me, like one of the things I liked. So obviously I knew Blue Harvest, I knew the name.
Yeah.
Family Guy famously like did turn to their parody and called it Blue Harvest or whatever in honor of that, but I didn't realize until watching that was like more of a rarity for the time, because like nowadays every one of those big movies has like a code name or something to keep it under wraps, but I didn't realize that in addition to it being that, it was also Star Wars was such a known quantity that when people were trying to negotiate contracts or rentals or something like that with the Star Wars name, those places were like, well, you can pay extra, so we're going to charge you extra. I was like, oh yeah, makes sense that you would then want to basically just like try and sell that you're making this like terrible schlocky B horror movie or something like that, instead of we're making a Star Wars, so can we like rent your costumes or whatever. I was like, oh, that was a like smart, savvy production necessity for people trying to kind of like rip Lucasfilm off. But yeah, one of the larger things that I realized from this, that going off of your kind of like, Lucas is very smart and maybe not with the dialogue and stuff, was just the realization that like everybody in this documentary seems to realize George isn't a great director. Like, he's not great at directing actors. He's not great at like dialogue on the page. He's not great at working with like people behind the scenes and designers and stuff like that. He's like, he fails on like nearly every level as a traditional director, but he is such a visionary and had a specific idea of what that vision was supposed to be, that like that all breaks through. And we obviously see like the failings of him as a director, I think more so with the prequels, where people weren't like pushing back against him and he wasn't having to like struggle to get his ideas across in the same way that he did during the original era. And it was just one of those like, yeah, like everybody just like kind of, it was the most maybe honest element of a documentary that is clearly produced by Lucasfilm, and in a documentary that it like 15 minutes earlier has George being like, yeah, I mean, he saw genius, so he invested in me. And the other guy being like, I thought George was brilliant. And so I like those elements that are like, here's how great George Lucas is, that I'm like, all right, that's a little fluff. But those juxtaposed with Harrison Ford being like, yeah, he just like the note he would give was basically like faster and more intensity. It's like, that was all he would like, that was how he thought to direct actors. Is just like, oof. And then like the people behind the scenes in London especially being like, yeah, we like you tell me what you want and I make it happen, don't step in and do my job. Like he was trying to be, he was so micromanagey. He is like the worst iteration of every boss I've ever had, kind of thing. And like if if Star Wars hadn't been such a great idea, he probably would have like become one of those directors that like nobody wants to work with.
Yeah.
Because I mean, like it was in, I mean, it and even that like popped up over the years with like, you know, there was I remember a trivia in Attack of the Clones that was like the guy who played Chancellor Valorum, whose name escapes me now, but he was like, yeah, I didn't want to come back because George doesn't know how to work with actors, and actors like working with other actors. It's like, yeah, that's, I mean, that tracks.
I think it's a great point. I mean, I think it's really interesting, the idea that, you know, in the traditional sense of a director, or kind of, you know, in a TV sense, to be like a showrunner, right? Because he didn't necessarily direct the other two, but he still very much was the main creative force behind it. He doesn't really work, right? He's not the best, but I think it is being such a visionary, right? Having such a great idea, and then not just having it, but I think what is key is being able to convince everybody else of that idea too, right? Like being able to convince everybody like, hey, this is a great thing I have, right? Because it's like one thing to have a good idea, but if no one buys it, then it doesn't really matter, right? And I think the ability for him to convey that like, this is going to be something cool, right? And get the cast on board, and get the production crew on board, so that even when they are like, you're micromanaging us and you're giving us bad direction, they still are like, all right, but like, we'll kind of do it, right? And it is, I think, something that
I mean, he didn't get them on board, though. Like, I mean, that's what a whole bunch of the New Hope stuff is. Like, he didn't have people on board. Like, everybody kind of thought, like, this, I mean, this is a payday. This isn't gonna, because they didn't see all the special effects and stuff that were happening after the fact. Like, the production crew was like, this doesn't make any sense. This isn't, like, what is this stupid thing? Like Kenny Baker kind of talks about, like, yeah, we didn't we didn't know what it was. We didn't think it was going to be, you know, anything to write home about. And the actors kind of feeling the same way in that regard. So it's, but it was, he had a clear enough idea of like what he wanted the end product to look like, that he didn't even need them to necessarily get on board. He just needed them to do what he needed them to do in the moment, and then he was going to kind of add everything in post, basically, and get it all edited together.
I think one of the things you touched on that I find really interesting is, right, because this movie doesn't obviously cover anything in the prequels, really, but the idea, right, of by the time 99 comes around, you know, George Lucas is a very different person in 1999 versus like 1976 when he's filming A New Hope, right? Like there's 20 years have passed in between these two things. And I think a lot of people describe why the prequels don't work for a lot of different reasons. And I think that's true. There are a lot of reasons why these movies don't necessarily work. But I think a not insignificant one you've touched on there is the fact that it is significantly harder to say no, or that's not a good idea, or that doesn't work, to 1999 or 2002 George Lucas versus 1977 or 1980 George Lucas, right? Like they're very different people, right? And like even at the height of like the original trilogy, right? Like even by the time they're doing like Return of the Jedi, that is still a very different George Lucas than 1999, right? Where like, because he won't do another movie for 16 years after that, right? Like he'll go off and just basically become like a myth of a man, right? And so
I mean, he'll step back like and spearhead ILM, but he won't be like directing films. Yeah,
he won't be directing films, right? And so like I think it allows this kind of like almost like mystical thing to like develop around him in the interim, so that by the time he comes back, it'll be like, I am George Lucas, like I did Star Wars. And I don't think he's going about it like that arrogantly, but I think it's just been like, this is my idea, I'm going to run through it kind of thing. And I think it's easy for him to forget how hard the original ones were to make. And I think for the cast and crew, it's like, why would we question it? Like, he clearly knows what he's doing. Look at the original trilogy, right? And I think that's just not how he operated in the same way in the original trilogy. There was more pushback. He had Lawrence Kasdan, who's kind of doing other things. He had Irvin Kershner, they very much clashed on Empire Strikes Back. And even Return of the Jedi was a very fraught production, right? And I think he learned lessons from the productions of Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. I just don't know if they were the right lessons in a lot of ways, in terms of him being like, all right, those movies were a pain in the ass to make. They were so hard. They were so difficult to make. I clashed with both the directors and Return of the Jedi's case, I basically had to like redirect that movie. Let's just make it simple. I'm gonna be the director for all three of these. I'll be the writer for all three of these. Like, I'll just do it myself, and it'll make it easier. It'll make it simpler. And the productions were probably easier and simpler, to his credit. The like trade-off from that, of course, was the fact that none of the movies were as good as any of the other three, because he didn't have someone who was also a big creative force pushing back in it, right? And I think I'd have loved to have seen what he could have done with more pushback on the prequel trilogy, right? I'd have loved to have seen what he could have done if he could have gotten like directors to direct these movies who are part of like the Directors Guild, right? Like, I still think it's super interesting, and one of the great what ifs of like, what would Return of the Jedi have looked like if Spielberg had directed that movie, right? Like, what would that film have been? Like, to me, is one of the great what ifs, even more so because of how much I do love that movie, right? It's like, how much would it have changed? What would have been added to it? What would have like been tweaked? Like, where would it have gone, right? In the same way of like, what would the prequel trilogy have been if he hadn't directed all three of them, right? If he had maybe done the direction for like Phantom Menace to like bring it back, but then if he'd traded it off to, you know, someone else for 2 and 3 to finish that story, like, I'm not sure. And I think the decisions he takes in the 80s that kind of forge his break with all of these guilds, they have repercussions later on down the line. They don't necessarily affect those movies in the immediacy, except for obviously not being able to get Spielberg for Jedi. But I feel like they're felt much more down the line. And I feel like his kind of go it alone approach is sort of solidified in those moments where it's like, I don't need them. And to be fair to George Lucas, he doesn't, right? He's George Lucas. He can not use him. It's going to be fine. He's going to make very successful movies at the box office. But I think in terms of the creative ideas, it'd have been super interesting to see. And then it is interesting too, because looking at the sequel trilogy, which obviously he wasn't involved in really in any way, and seeing the hit or miss nature of that makes it sort of compelling too, of like, I am also not unpersuaded of the idea that like, these are just really hard movies to make, right? Like, any movie is really hard to make. And then even more so with Star Wars, and even more so with, you know, part of me wonders if it was even possible to make a really great prequel trilogy, or if it was even possible to make a really great sequel trilogy, right? Or if no matter what, they would have just been bogged down in certain things, or if they'd have been bogged down by, you know, having to go either too close or too far away from the original trilogy, right? Because I think, I mean, I'm looking more at the sequel trilogy here, right? Where Force Awakens gets attacked a lot for being a carbon copy of New Hope. It's not, but that's the cheap and easy criticism of it, right? Last Jedi gets criticized for like destroying the original trilogy. It doesn't, but that's the easy criticism to make, right? And then Rise of Skywalker, I just really have no idea what happened there, but it's just, you know, it's sort of a weird combination of both of them, while also like trying to like jerk off to the original trilogy, and like it doesn't work on any level. And so, and the prequels don't work because prequels are some of the hardest movies to do, right? Like, I think prequels are a really hard thing to nail. Like, there are a lot more bad prequel movies than there are good prequel movies, just in cinema in general, right? And so I think to try to do a trilogy of them is not easy. And I think I am just curious if it's just possible that like Star Wars is just a thing that is really hard to do, right? Like, and you have to have someone like Dave Filoni who just like, I think, gets it on such a fundamental level, right? And even then there are parts of like Dave Filoni, right, where he was afforded a 7-season long TV show to figure it out, right, too. Like, there's a lot of not good in the Attack of the Clones TV show. It just was able to find its way over 7-8 years. And so I think,
I mean, even longer than that, because there were giant hiatuses in between some of those seasons. There were big gaps. Yeah.
Right? And so I think that's a good point, too, is that, like, it's also okay to say maybe Star Wars is really hard to make, and maybe these 3 movies are just, it like, even more so than, like, it's incredible they were made. It's like, it's incredible they were good. Like, honestly, like, they shouldn't be. Like, they shouldn't be good. And the fact they are is, like, its own, like, testament to, I think, everything just kind of coming together in a really good way in terms of like the cast and the direction and the writing and the production, everything just clicking right for these 3 movies. And they just weren't able to replicate that in either of the two trilogies, right? And I think the movie that comes closest, which is Rogue One for me personally, in and of itself had a troubled production, right? And wasn't necessarily a seamless kind of thing all the way through. And I think there's an element of just chaos to Star Wars that I think can't be understated as well, right? Like there's a lot of luck and chaos to it, and it's sort of cool to see that be shown in the documentary.
Yeah, I mean, I think like going off of that idea, like the idea of just a trilogy in general having all three be hits is incredibly rare.
Yes.
And let alone this being like one of the first, attempting to do it.
Like I would argue it's basically just this and Lord of the Rings, basically, that are like all three are like great movies.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the modern analog I would look at is weird because it's not. I mean, it is in some cases like a series of trilogies, but like all the MCU stuff, like the fact that there are relatively few misses in there, like. There are some that people don't like here and there, but like by and large, outside of like the first two Thor movies and like the Incredible Hulk and I guess Iron Man 2, people are like, that is a pretty good run of films, all things considered. And they're like 24 deep or 25 deep or whatever now. So like that is again like super the anomaly, and we see when when everybody else starts trying to make their own like cinematic universes. Very varying degrees of success in that, and you like need a good strong visionary kind of leading things. I was going to bring it back to one of your other favorite talking points of Bond. Like, is there in the history of Bond like a run of 3 movies that like hit, or is it much like you kind of described there with Star Wars, just much more like very hit or miss kind of thing, because it's going to be all about like the idea that's brought to the table and the team that's working on that specific project that's going to really dictate whether this is going to succeed or not. Like, yes, they'll all be James Bond, they'll all feel like James Bond, but whether or not that succeeds or not is a different thing.
I think the best example of James Bond would be like the Sean Connery era films, right? Where they had very similar directors for a lot of them. Guy Hamilton did a lot of James Bond movies in the like 60s and 70s actually. And they had a lot of the same like kind of production designers, and sort of like the Daniel Craig movies, the Sean Connery ones very much are one story being told, right? They're very much direct sequels to each other that are kind of referenced like that. So you could argue, if you're really generous, like the first 5 Bond movies are all the best run the series ever had. If you want to maybe not count Dr. No because it's a little rough around the edges now because it was the first one. That run from Russia with Love, Goldfinger, Thunderball, You Only Live Twice is pretty stellar all the way through, right? Like 3 of those 5, all of them but Thunderball, are probably in the top 7 Bond movies, right? And you could argue all 3 of those are 3 of the 5 best. I mean, they're pretty much all fantastic. From Russia with Love in particular, and You Only Live Twice personally are probably my 2 favorite Bond movies along with Skyfall. So I mean,
but then so it becomes kind of the same story, the same trajectory, where like once you get away from that kind of like initial inception of the idea, everything becomes about trying to like recreate the magic of those original ideas, and that's going to be a very hit or miss scenario.
And I think one of the things you see with James Bond that's really interesting is they can never fully commit after Connery leaves what they're doing, right? And which I think is sort of similar to what the sequel trilogy kind of had happen to it, where like they can't commit if they want to continue having these all be movies that are just sequels to one another. So they have references to that idea, right? And it very much is clearly ultimately like the canon of James Bond is that like they're all just sequels to one another. It's all one story being told still. But then they take place over 50 years, and they're very clearly referencing that, right? And said like this is a man who's just an agent for a long time. And
then suddenly goes back to having a prequel, I guess.
Right, and then they
Casino
like
Royale.
rebooted. Yeah, and then they rebooted and like, all right, cool. No, we're just gonna commit to like fully doing it just as like they're actually sequels, and we're not gonna have any sort of ambiguity here. Like it is his story being told. And I think again, sort of like the sequel trilogy, the Daniel Craig one for me doesn't really work. Certainly not as well as the Sean Connery one, is because they tried to be both Force Awakens and Last Jedi in his movies, and didn't recognize the inherent kind of contradiction in that idea of like, we're going to really be like doing like a ton of homages and references, and we really love these movies, but also there are no sacred cows. We're breaking everything down, right? And I think it's like this, it's a very disjointed movie, right? Where like basically every one of his movies flips back and forth, and if they want to be a Force Awakens or if they want to be The Last Jedi. And the one that gets it the best, which is Skyfall, does actually somehow manage to blend them together really incredibly. And again, like we said for Star Wars, it is a miracle that movie is as good as it is, right? And it takes a Oscar-winning director in Sam Mendes to put it together. Daniel Craig, who like actually gave a damn in the movie, and like the cast all buying into the idea, them all like committing to it, right? And again, going back to the big Star Wars, some of Star Wars like theme, that movie plays with the history of James Bond so well and gets it, and that the legacy of it all, and it pays off. But more often than not, James Bond movies don't take risks, right? They are afraid of risk a lot of the times. When they do take a risk, like Timothy Dalton, he gets punished for it, right? He gets savaged for it, right? Like he's still like a black name that is said, right? Even though his movies are easily the most like different and weird and dark of anything from like 1969 to like 2005. Like his movies are the weird shit. But people didn't want weird shit, right? They liked it safe. They liked Roger Moore, who was just kind of flippant and fun and chill. Even if his movies are, you know, break even at best, if you're generous, right? Maybe not even that. Maybe he only has 2 or 3 great movies in Roger Moore's like 15-year run. And so I think James Bond is a really interesting kind of counter example to Star Wars, because they mirror each other in a lot of ways, and because that series is one that is so obsessed, just like Star Wars, with where it began, right? Like, similarly to how everything in Star Wars is just revolving around the original trilogy, everything in James Bond revolves around Sean Connery. Like, every person who is James Bond has to compete with Sean Connery's legacy, and just like in Star Wars, it's impossible. You can't, right? By the very nature that you have to compete against it, by the very fact that that is the standard you're competing against, it's sort of always impossible to bring everybody on board with the idea that this is better or this is as good as or anything, and they're all just kind of doing their own iterations of it to varying degrees of success. And so I actually think they're really interesting companion series in a lot of ways, even more so because they're pretty much the only things that have existed for 40 plus years in Star Wars case and almost 60 years in James Bond's case, right? Like no other film series is like that. Not even the MCU, right? The MCU is, compared to them, brand new comparatively, right? It is so fresh. And so it's super interesting to see them. And that might be part of the reason why they are my 2 favorite film series, is that they are just so different, right? Like there's nothing else that's really like James Bond, right? Like even Jason Bourne isn't the same, right? Like it's very different. And there's nothing really like Star Wars at all. Even all the other sci-fi like Western shooters, which are inspired by it, that can be great in their own right, are different. They don't have like the exact same kind of like chemical makeup of it. And so they're both very interesting in that regard.
Just talking about that, just with Casino Royale coming out in 2006, the MCU is both new, like younger than Daniel Craig, James Bond, and the prequels. And it's like, oh yeah, that's, I mean, they definitely like, especially after like a few years, they started hitting like hard and fast and like 2 to 3 movies a year kind of thing. But yeah, it is like, you know, it's only 2008. We're 13 years into this crazy experiment.
It is as old as The Dark Knight, right? And The Dark Knight doesn't seem that old. That's like my point of it. Like it's like not that long ago.
Yeah. Anyway, back to Star Wars itself. Let's talk about your rankings. Where would you have everything fall? We jokingly put together our list of what you would rank everything at, and just to bring anybody up to speed on that, I will run through the communal list that we ranked for Logan. We had Rogue One at the bottom because Logan just hates that movie. Empire Strikes Back at number 12. Terrible, worst of the original trilogy, clearly. Revenge of the Sith at number 11, A New Hope at number 10, Force Awakens at number 9, Empire of Dreams at number 8, Return of the Jedi right smack in the middle, the most meh movie ever, given Logan's real disdain towards those kinds of movies. The Clone Wars at number 6, Attack of the Clones at number 5, Solo, specifically because there's just such a great focus on last names in this universe that really gets cemented in Solo here at number 4.
Great point.
The Last Jedi at number 3 because Luke has never been better. The Rise of Skywalker at number 2, which is just an A++ of a movie, and number 1 with its S tier midichlorian love, The Phantom Menace. So that was Logan's joke rankings from from that D+ show. Where do you want to set the record straight? How do you actually want to put things?
I feel like we'll go bottom to top, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, Rise of Skywalker is my favorite movie
Yeah.
in the series. Like we talked about that. I don't want to spend too much time on like Rise of Skywalker because I don't want to like bash obviously all the work that was spent on it. But like, yeah, it's my favorite one. I just think it does. That is the one for me out of all the Star Wars movies. I just think it doesn't understand the series the most, which is I think part of why I find it so egregious. Personally, just like it just doesn't get almost any of what makes Star Wars special, really. And it very clearly, I think, reads, especially watching it on Summer Star Wars, as just they're trying to almost appease the worst elements of the Star Wars fan base, and they couldn't really even do that good. And so, yeah, Rise of Skywalker for me would be last. Let me pull up my list. I am with Cameron Abbott. I do not have Empire Dreams ranked on my list. If I had to rank it, it'd be somewhere in the middle, but it's a documentary. It's like its own little asterisk thing.
Yeah.
Above Rise of Skywalker for me is the Clone Wars animated movie. This actually maybe changed originally for me, and maybe I had it a spot higher. But ultimately, I have the Clone Wars animated movie below it because I took a line from Trevor. I just wouldn't want to watch it again. I think that's like even like Attack of the Clones, which is going to be the movie directly above it, I'll watch Attack of the Clones again, right? Like, I think Attack of the Clones is, as we all do, pretty flawed, but I would rather watch that than the Clone Wars animated movie. Even though it's shorter, it's just that, I mean, it is so obviously not a movie. It is 3 or 4 episodes stitched together, and it's just like, the first season of the Clone Wars is the worst, and it is just the first season of the Clone Wars. There are great moments. Unfortunately for me, I feel like they happen pretty much in the beginning, and then it's just kind of a bit more of a slog after that. But it is still, it is still enjoyable enough. It is leagues above Rise of Skywalker for me. And it is kind of cool to have, I'm glad I watched it for the first time, right? And got to see kind of where Clone Wars went from that. But yeah, I would have the Clone Wars animated movie 11th, I guess it would be.
Yeah.
And then number 10 for me would be Attack of the Clones. It's just not good. I mean, it is that can really be the review in and of itself. It's just not good. I think Attack of the Clones is maybe the weirdest Star Wars movie for me, especially in like the first 6 movies that like I know like the back of my hand, right? That are just so ingrained in me, because I feel like I always trick myself into being like, it's not that bad, right? It's not like that boring. It's not that slow. It's not that fill in the blank thing. And then like I always watch it again, and I'm always like, it's pretty rough. Or like even last year, whenever me and Xavier went through and watched like the original trilogy all in like one weekend, and then we started going and through like episode 1 and 2, and we were going to go through 3 and do like the whole 6 movies right there. We like did the original trilogy in one weekend, waited a couple days, and then did episode 1, and then did like episode 2 like that weekend, and we were just like, it's rough. And that's where we tap it. We never got to episode 3 because episode 2 was just so, it's a lot, right? Like it just doesn't work. And it sucks because there's like so much cool stuff in Attack of the Clones. I think actually, like, I love Kamino, and I love that whole like culture and idea, and like the aliens are like the most like, that is the little gray men made big, but like, and it's super cool, right? And I love the fact that we get to see kind of a seedier side of Coruscant. Like it physically spends so much time on Coruscant. I dig that, right? Like it's really the movie that it gives you the most of like the Coruscant world, and I loved that as a kid, and I still love it now. Like I would love to get more Coruscant, right? But it's
Rest
pretty
in
much
peace,
everything else.
1313, the video game.
I literally was thinking it. But like basically nothing works other than Obi-Wan, right? Like only Ewan McGregor really works in this movie. And that's not Hayden Christensen's fault or Natalie Portman's fault. They're just not really that interested in characters in this movie. And yeah, I mean, The Sand, man. So that one is number 10. It's the worst of the original 6.
Yep.
Outside of that, next I have, and this is also one I thought a lot about, and I could maybe be persuaded on a different day to rank this differently, but I'm going to put Solo next. I think for me, I'm going to go back to my classic line of just, it's so meh, right? Like, I think it just is Solo to me is like a 6.5 and a 7.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's just like, sure, right? And the movie above that is also that to some degree, but I think it hits higher highs. I think Solo just sort of bums me out a lot of the time, right? Like, because there's so much fun to be had with a smuggler story, right? Like, I think how did I word it? I think the way I worded it on the podcast is that like Solo works best when you forget that it's about Han Solo.
You forget it's a Han Solo movie. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is still true, right? Like if they just made this like, here's a dope smuggling movie, right? And they didn't have to be bound by the fact that because it's Han Solo, you have to do certain things, or you feel like you have to do certain things as the directing team and the writing team. And right, so I just think it doesn't work. I don't like, obviously, a lot of the big Han Solo moments. I don't like the last name thing. I don't like the Kessel Run. But I will say, to Solo's credit, and I hope I conveyed this in the podcast we did on it as well, there are elements of it that I do really like, right? Obviously, Lando is great. Donald Glover nails Lando. But one of the things that I really was surprised watching it again, how much I enjoyed, is Woody Harrelson. I think Woody Harrelson is great. And like, honestly, I would have loved to have seen this just be a Beckett movie, right? Like, or like, even for them to somehow do like a Beckett standalone thing now, right? Or like as like a TV like mini series or something. Like that character I found really interesting, right? And I love Woody Harrelson's performance, and I think he actually ends up being the heart of the movie in a lot of ways and gives it a lot of its emotional weight. And so I think that is one of the things that Solo does really well. Mm-hmm. Chewbacca's Chewbacca. He's obviously great. But for me, the movie is Solo is ironically enough defined not by Han Solo, but by Beckett and Lando. We won't even get to Cara. It's not even worth it. I'm sure she's a lovely person, but like it just, that character does not work for me. And so, that's why I would slide in Solo.
Yeah, Solo was the probably the most interesting for me, because that was the one I think I came into this thinking like I was gonna like it more, or like more than I ultimately do, because I was like I remembered like the parts of the movie I liked much more so. Mm-hmm. Like I like pretty much all the performances. Mm-hmm. Like I don't hate Emilia Clarke as Cara as much as everybody else does, but it was very much like my issues were with the script and stuff, and I thought it was just like, okay, there are like a handful of moments I didn't like in there, but I really liked, the cast at the core of the thing, and I thought that a lot of the hate thrown towards that movie was unfairly directed, because it was people that were set up to fail because they were never going to be
100%,
Harrison
100%.
Ford and stuff like that. But it was like going back and watching it with like for this, where I was like, oh no, there's just a lot of really bad in there, and I just like had swept a lot of that under the rug trying to defend the movie. So yeah, it was 10 on my personal list. So pretty much right down
I
there
will
with
say
you.
The last thing with Solo I'll say is that like I think both those things are true, to be fair. Like I definitely think there's a lot not good in this movie, and I also think that this movie had really the tiniest of margins to succeed, right? Like I think it is far easier to see this movie failing than it is to see it succeeding. And that's, I think it's what we were talking about on the podcast a little bit. It was just like, you're taking one of the most iconic characters in the series and trying to do something with it. And like, again, like I just talked about for Sean Connery, like people are going to obviously compare him to Harrison Ford, and that's not fair. Both because Harrison Ford is a phenomenal actor who's like literally created two iconic characters in Han Solo and Indiana Jones, to say nothing of Jack Ryan, arguably, in Patriot games, and also because he can't be Harrison Ford, right? It's just not possible, right? And so he's going to do his own thing. I don't hate his performance necessarily. I hate more what he was given to work with, and probably the way he was told to do it, right? Like, I'd have loved to see him be a bit more... I'd have loved for this movie to be more comedic than it is. And I think a lot of the best flashes of it are when it is sort of more comedic, right? And is kind of more of a comedy, right? And so I think, yeah, it really never was given the proper, I think, tools to fully succeed. And it's also just, there's a lot of bad in here. And I think both are very true and both coexist in this movie, which is unfortunate. After Solo, we then go to the first one that I would say is just straight up like, I think this is a good movie. And it is Phantom Menace. Phantom Menace to me hits right at a 7. That is, it is good. It is a good movie. Is there a lot I don't like about Phantom Menace? Sort of, but like not really. I think there's a lot that I find very meh about Phantom Menace, right? Like, to me, as I've tried to convey, I think Phantom Menace's biggest weakness is the fact that the second act exists. Really, just in its entirety, that is the weakest part of the movie. I think that, you know, Tatooine's rough, man. It's really rough, and I think that Tatooine doesn't work a lot of the time. I think it goes on way too long. I think it drags for way too long. But I think that the Duel of Fates is still amazing, right? Like, the end of the movie is still great. Darth Maul is a great character who should have been the main bad of the entire prequel trilogy, but he's not, and it's unfortunate. And Qui-Gon is good if I don't understand maybe the full love people have for him. But he's still a cool character. Phantom Menace is a very much like a 7 movie. And I think the way I described it to you earlier was, you know, it is basically the movie if I have to have something just like on a lazy Sunday and watch them doing other stuff, I would put on Phantom Menace and just like chill out to that movie. So that falls in at number 9 for me is Phantom Menace.
Number 8. So what is your number 7?
For me, number 7, next off is going to be Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. This is another one that, like, I would allow in any given day, this and the movie above it could kind of flip places. Ultimately, I'm going to put it at number 7. It is the best of the prequels, I think, hands down. I think what holds it back is the fact that I hate the Yoda and Palpatine stuff. Like I talked about on the podcast, it is in the run for me one of my least favorite sequences in all of Star Wars. It doesn't make any sense. It's really dumb, but it's because it's a prequel and they have to get this character out of the way and they can't have him beat Palpatine like he would normally. So they just be like, all right, you have to go over here and just be in a swamp now for 20 years because we have to have you there. So like that doesn't work, obviously. But I think a lot of this movie actually does work. I think this is the one where George Lucas has kind of gotten it the most because I think this is the prequel story that he wanted to tell from the very beginning. And then he kind of was like, I'm going to make it a trilogy. And then he had to kind of come up with 2 other movies, really. This is the one that I think he always kind of had in his mind for 20 years. This is what it felt like, certainly.
Real quick on the Emperor Palpatine / Yoda stuff, I was just thinking, like, a much better way of executing that would have been Palpatine in like full machinations mode and taunting Yoda into a very public like attempt on his life, so that like all of Coruscant sees Yoda trying to kill the Chancellor. And that's what forces Yoda into exile. And we don't get that. We just get Yoda giving up. And it's just like, what is...
That'd be... Yeah. And that'd be such a cool idea, right? Or like, yeah, like there's like a secret camera in the office or in the Senate chamber, something like that, like where they're being recorded and shown to the audience, like anything. But it's just like, Yoda just gives up. And he wasn't even like, he just got knocked down and was like, I guess I'm done. And so that's unfortunate, but Hayden Christensen, I think, gives his best performance in Star Wars here, which admittedly, what a bar. But I do think he does more with Anakin in this movie. I think Ewan McGregor continues to be the best part of the prequel trilogy in this movie. I think he's great as Obi-Wan. I think the Obi-Wan Anakin dynamic feels earned largely. One thing I thought was really interesting too is their goodbye feels so sudden and abbreviated because it's just like suddenly Anakin is like, I have to go across the world, and everyone's like, I gotta go across the galaxy over here, and like just like leave, and they say goodbye, not in a super melodramatic way of like goodbye, and the music dims down, it's like it's our last goodbye ever. It's like, no, like they're gonna see each other again, obviously, so just treat it as that, like a quick goodbye, here's a funny joke, and they're done. Obviously with each of them not knowing that it is their last time they're going to see each other while still the same people, really, right? I think the Obi-Wan Anakin lightsaber duel was great, and I think it's particularly effective because these are two men at the height of their powers. These are two men in total mastery of what they're doing, and their lightsaber duel is depicted as such, right? Like, it is very much not the original trilogy lightsaber duels, which I actually think, like I talked before about, and like we'll get to in a couple minutes, are stronger in a lot of ways in terms of their emotional impact. This is pure show. This is two guys flexing on each other for an entire duel, and it's great. This, to me, is this is a dance that they're doing with each other throughout the entire like Mustafar fight, and it works really well for me. I think Anakin losing and the fire, Obi-Wan's speech at him is all so operatic, but in ways that work, right? I think it's, again, Star Wars is a space opera, and this movie very much is. Literally at one point they go to an opera, I guess. And so yeah, like I think Revenge of the Sith works really well. I think Grievous is a cool bad guy. Again, a little bit like Darth Maul, like I said for Phantom Menace. I wish we had more of him, and basically they just never had Count Dooku, and I think the prequel trilogy would have been better. But yeah, Revenge of the Sith is good. It is flawed. It is messy. It is dramatic. It is operatic. It is grand. It is a movie in big, bold letters, and I kind of love it. It's also easily like hella sad, and Order 66, that sequence I think is done so well, and it still has such a like emotional gut punch. And it is one of the few things from the prequel trilogy that they have left basically untouched. They haven't tried to tweak or like fix it. Just like, no, that moment was great, and we've incorporated it into like everything. And I think that is a testament to how well done that sequence was. So I will say this is number 8 is Revenge of the Sith. Misses out on the.
It was number 7.
Oh, number 7. It is the exact middle movie. Then perfect. That is a perfect. I love that for this movie. Perfect. That's great. And then so number 6 then for me is going to be number 6 is going to be Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi. I am shocked. I'm surprised just as you guys were. Shout out to Trevor Starkey, always banging the drum on this movie, and doing a whole podcast just to get me to watch this one movie again. No, I mean, I think Last Jedi is really messy, right? Like, I think that element I had of it has never changed. I think the movie is really messy. I think it is a bull in the china shop, deliberately so, and I think it works and it doesn't work to varying degrees for me, obviously. Obviously, the biggest issue with this movie is Luke for me. I will say, to its credit, I don't dislike everything it does to Luke Skywalker, right? I don't have the same kind of reaction I immediately had when I watched it the first time, but there is a lot I don't like about its Luke arc. And there's a lot I love, right? I think what it does with Luke as a legend is super interesting and really smart and really clever. I don't like what it is Luke as a person necessarily, but I also, am not arrogant enough to say that what I think has to be what everyone else also thinks. And I love the fact that this is a movie that does garner such passionate fans of it, right? Like, including, obviously, in your case, or Ben or Barrett or the countless millions of people who love this movie. And I think that's super interesting. I think it's super rad. I think it is a testament to the movie's own message of like, the legend lives on in all of us, right? And we each have our own different kind of interpretation of the legend of Luke and what he is and who he is. And we're all carrying around a slightly different version of the truth with us, but we're all still inspired by it, right? And I think that's sort of beautiful in its own way. And so even if it doesn't completely land for me, I still like that idea. I think it has one of the most emotionally satisfying endings of any Star Wars movie. I would maybe make a case of any movie. I think that final shot of like, you know, Luke given "you're completely wrong for like these 3 reasons" kind of speech at the end is beautifully done and encapsulates so much about what makes that character fun, I think. And then the fact that that then ties into the kids on a random planet basically reenacting that moment, right? And then one of them going out and looking at the stars just like Luke did all those years ago, I think is such a great moment. I like Rose. I've always liked Rose. I think this movie, on the other side of the ledger, is the one that begins to not really know what to do with Finn at times, it feels like. And that kind of sucks. I think this movie, right, like, it's the unfortunate part of the sequel trilogy where I'd have loved to see the full nature of Princess Leia's story. We don't really get it kind of just ends abruptly here. But I think her moment with Luke is great. I think her moment where she gets blown into space and comes back is less so. I am a person who doesn't love that. But I love how salty they are about that, and how, like, you know, Rian Johnson's literally like getting like a book from a shelf and saying like Jedi Force abilities that they have. It doesn't make it any less dumb, I will acknowledge, but sure enough, it's based in some sort of canon. And so, like, I think that's sort of the movie, right? Like, it is this weird thing that, a little bit like the original trilogy, shouldn't work in a lot of ways. And in some ways it doesn't, I think, personally. But in some ways it does. And it is really interesting to watch this and the movie I have right above it, because they are such effective yin and yangs, I think. And so, yeah, I mean, this movie makes the top half. I'm shocked by it. There's still a lot I don't like, obviously. But I also find it really interesting because I will lay the seed here that I'll bring to kind of full, you know, fruition in a little bit. But Luke Skywalker is a very atypical hero. And this movie does a lot with that idea in ways I like and don't like. But that's all I'll say for now, because I'll delve more into that in a little bit. But yeah, not Rise of Skywalker, Last Jedi is number 6 for me.
Yep.
For number 5, breaking into the top 5, this is actually a really interesting one. I have Force Awakens at number 5, which is maybe Force Awakens is the movie that I'm most satisfied I still love as much as I thought I did, right? Because I had seen Force Awakens. This is probably the 3rd or 4th time I had seen it, but I hadn't seen it in a couple of years now. And I was really happy that I still love this movie. I love Force Awakens. I really do. Like, this is an A for me. Like, I really do love this movie. And, like, this to me is, I feel like, a little bit like where you are with Last Jedi. Like, I don't love it as much as you like Last Jedi, obviously, but, like, I love this movie. I understand all of the complaints people have about it. Like, I get them, and in a way that I think you understand why people don't like Last Jedi. I understand why you wouldn't like this movie, but it works really effectively for me. It is just, there is just like magic coursing through this film, I think, and it's impossible for me, right? Like, I am not capable to remove the excitement around this movie coming out, right? From watching this movie. Like, every time I watch the movie, I think of the trailers first coming out, right? And like the visceral feeling it felt like the whole internet had about how great it was going to be, right? And it's the video of like the priest crying watching the movie, right? Like watching the trailer and getting so excited about it, right? It is all of these things. And so I think that's fed into this. I think this is just, in a lot of ways, a celebration of Star Wars. And that's kind of cool. Like, I like that idea. And it's funny because I like that idea in spite of so many of the core elements being things I don't enjoy, right? Like, I don't like the fact they blow up the planets because it doesn't make any sense, and I don't understand the stakes of it. And I don't know what it means. I still don't know what it means. So why? It's a weird scene, and like the Republic is just like, okay, I have nothing to feel about that. Cause like random planets and not Coruscant, and I never see like, okay, sure. I don't like, as we talked about before, the fact that this is the movie that basically starts to open up the end of Return of the Jedi and say, what if we start messing around with it? I obviously don't like that. I don't like the fact that Luke is just gone. I don't like the fact that Han and Leia are like this weird separated dynamic. I don't like a lot of what the movie does, but in spite of that, I love the movie. And I think we've given J.J. Abrams a healthy amount of criticism on this podcast, on lots of podcasts, on about 13 of them, in fact. We've given him a lot of shit. And I think it's deserved at times. But to his credit, J.J. Abrams may not be able to answer questions, but he can ask really cool things, and he can set up a table really well. And he sets up a really interesting table that appeals to me, even if I don't like what I'm like, even if I don't like what he did, I somehow am still so kind of excited by it, right? And attracted to this idea. I think Finn is probably the best he's ever going to be here. He's such an interesting, complex character who's in the rebellion for 100% selfish reasons. He's not in the rebellion, right? He's in it just for himself, and he's in it just for Rey. I love that idea. I think Poe is great. I think Rey is a breath of fresh air and such an invigorating and exciting and thrilling protagonist. And I think one of the great tragedies of the fact that they're basically are doing nothing with a sequel trilogy now and like don't really want to touch it at all with a 10-foot pole is the fact that we're not really going to get too much more with Rey, it seems like, soon, because she's a great character. And Finn is too, and I would love to see more stories with them. But obviously I think the reaction of the last two films in this trilogy kind of made them say, what if we just stay away from that for a while? Which is like fair, I guess. Whatever. I don't know.
You could go watch the Lego Star Wars holiday special that
I know.
Frank and I did.
I want to. Yeah.
Like they do a continuation with Rey training Finn to be a Jedi.
Yeah. And I think it's super cool, right? Like I think this movie just is sort of a magic to it, right? Like I think the closest parallel I can describe to Force Awakens is it's a little bit like Sorcerer's Stone for me. Where like Sorcerer's Stone isn't the best Harry Potter book, but I love Sorcerer's Stone. I love that book. I love that story because it just has such a sense of like magic to it, I think. And this one does too, right? Like they treat the original trilogy in a very kind of reverential way, right? And every small touch is like so like in awe of it. And I understand why people might not like that, but I think it's cool because these characters are basically us, right? Who grew up with it and who would be like awestruck meeting Han or seeing the Falcon or learning about Jedi or the Force or lightsabers. And that's all of us. And so I enjoy it. It is the best thing that is not directly tied to the original trilogy, I will say. And so, yeah, it is flawed, but I like it a lot. And so that would be my number 5. And the first like one that I think is like a truly great movie. Mm-hmm. And so then getting into the top 4, I am not unpersuaded of the argument. I think like you, Trevor, that Rogue One is a better movie than A New Hope. I am not unpersuaded by that argument at all, right? I do not have the same love for A New Hope. I've never loved A New Hope as much as Cameron or like a lot of people do, but I am a coward and I just can't do it. And so Rogue One ultimately is 4th for me, by the skin of its teeth. And again, for the third and last time, this is one where if you really pressed me on it, I could be persuaded to probably have it number 3. But I will have it number 4, if only because, like you say, it is very dependent on A New Hope a lot, right? It obviously is very much making that movie better. But Rogue One is fantastic. I mean, oh my God, the movie is phenomenal. I mean, it is. I almost have no critiques of that movie. Like, I think it works on almost every single level. which is something that I can't say about the movie that is going to be directly in front of it in A New Hope. I have some issues with New Hope. I don't really have any with Rogue One. I think it works really, really well. I think that it is incredible. Like, it is, to me, the best prequel movie all the way through that I've seen. Again, Godfather 2 doesn't count because it's like half a prequel, so that's my easy out. But like otherwise, I think it is just phenomenal, right? I think it gives us real stakes and real emotions and ties into that central element of the original trilogy better than any movie in the series, I personally think, in terms of understanding what it's about, right? In terms of this idea of hope, right? And rebellions are built off of hope, and the fact that like the core theme throughout Star Wars is hope. And so often, I think people misunderstand the idea of hope in this series and in just life in general. And it's something that I've long had conversations about and debated about and discussed. And the fact that, like, I am obviously a very hopeful person. Hi, maybe you've never met me before. It's a weird podcast to jump into. But hi, I'm Logan. I'm a very hopeful person. Right? I do believe in, good in people. But that is not a passive thing. And I think that is so often how hope is portrayed. Whereas I think hope, especially as seen in this movie and in the original trilogy, is an active thing you have to do every day, right? It is you hoping, you having this hope and then actively doing something to build off of that. It is you doing something to make the world better. And I think that Rogue One understands that, and it understands consequences, and it understands, I think, that hope is not an easy thing to do. It is really hard, and it takes action every day to make that hope into more of a thing, but it also understands symbols really well. Because Star Wars is a series that is sort of built off of symbols, and it understands the power of them. It understands the power of just keeping this faint, flickering, dying flame of the rebellion alive when the rebellion is basically fracturing apart at the seams. And the idea of we can do something that can bring it together and fan the flames a little bit further so that you can have a new hope arise, even if we all can't see it. We just believe in this idea of a hope, even if we don't even know what it is yet. I think Rogue One's great. I think Mads Mikkelsen is great in it. I think the whole cast is great in it. Diego Luna is great in it. I think it is just a fantastic movie. And Felicity Jones is great in it, obviously, as Jyn Erso. And so I really like this movie a lot. This is one that I am maybe the most happy with seeing again. Because originally, I would probably put this movie like 7th, right? Like somewhere in that mid-tier range. So to see it again and see how much I love it has been awesome. Rogue One is great. Shout out to Gary Whitta and the other writers who I don't know because they don't work with Kind of Funny, but they're very great people too, I'm sure.
I remember this one coming, like, whenever we would talk about Rogue One before Summer of Star Wars, this was one where you were, if I recall correctly, very much like... great third act, but it's really, really slow start and build.
That's 100% what I was saying. Yep.
And when you watched it, and I think we talked about it at length in a off mic for a previous podcast or something, or like prior to us sitting down and recording that episode of that D Plus show, and like hearing you have had come around on that and were like, no, like this is firing on all cylinders all through, and it's doing great setup work to really pay off in the third act, and it just makes the third act stronger because of everything that comes before it. I was like, yes, we got him. We got one.
It's interesting too because like watching it obviously a couple weeks ago now, I am not even like unpersuaded the argument that like the third act might be the one. It might be like my least favorite act of the movie. Like I think that first act of the movie and what it is in terms of establishing these characters is so good. Like this movie builds so well, and there's really only one other Star Wars movie I think that does it as well, maybe two, in terms of how it builds you to that final act, which is in spectacular. But I think this movie, its first act and its second acts are both so excellent, and what it does in terms of getting you to that point to where you feel each one of the characters like demises, I think is like great writing all the way through. All right, it's top 3. It's the original trilogy. Let's go, baby. Let's rank some movies.
Yeah. I've had your list like written out since you said Revenge of the Sith at number 7. I was like, all right, here's the rest of here's how the rest of his list is gonna play out.
A New Hope is number 3. Again, I could really probably be persuaded any given day to watching it. A New Hope is sort of, it's a weird movie. I think it is a little bit like the opposite of Attack of the Clones, where Attack of the Clones, I always say, maybe I'm being too hard on that movie. Maybe like I like it more than I think I do, right? Maybe like there's more good in this movie than I remember. And then I watch it and I'm like, no, it's pretty rough. A New Hope, I feel like I always say like, I feel like I'm always more down on it after like, or before I watch it. I'm always like, is it as good as I remember it being? Like, is it this great? And then I watch it and I'm like, yeah, New Hope is just like a perfect movie in a lot of ways, right? Like I think A New Hope is pretty clearly the slowest of the original trilogy. I mean, it just obviously is. They spent a lot of time on the Death Star.
There's that, and that was definitely something else that stood out in Empire of Dreams, is watching them like as they're putting together the edit, and you're just seeing like these very long pause. It immediately makes sense why George's like direction was faster and with more intensity, because it is just like a trudge of like scenes, and you have like and there's like one where Alec Guinness kind of says his line, and then like Mark Hamill has like a good 5 seconds of reacting to that line before he like does his own thing, and I was just like, what are you doing? Oh my god.
Yeah, it's a weird movie, right? Like, I think in some ways A New Hope is like the strangest film because it was the first, right? They're all so raw. Like Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher in particular, they're just so young. I mean, these are young actors and actresses, and I think it's sort of endearing in that. I think A New Hope is maybe the most endearing Star Wars movie because you can see like just off screen everything, like all the stagehands right there. Like it does just feel like it's just barely been put together, and I think that lends something to it. I think this is the most classic story in the series. And out of all the movies, this is a classic hero's journey story wrapped into one. This is the only movie in the entire series that really works as a standalone film. Like even the 2 standalone movies don't work as standalone films like this one does. And there's something to that. There is something to the idea that there didn't need to be a sequel to this. I'm really happy that we got them, obviously, but it could have just ended here and it would have worked just as well. And I think there's just George Lucas is, George Lucas. He is what it is. You like him or you don't like him. It's sort of indifferent to me. But he hit something that maybe if he had done this movie 10 more times, he couldn't have hit it again. But he hit it here, and it just works, right? Like this movie just has that kind of current of magic to it, like a Back to the Future does, right? Where just like it just works. And it just clicks, and it just is so seamless a lot of the times that, I mean, it is a great movie. And I feel like I just don't have the ability to put it below Rogue One right now. Again, maybe that'll change it in the future. But I have it number 3. I think it is a fantastic movie. I think it is the weakest of the original trilogy. And I think if people are being honest about it, they would also agree. But I understand why people don't necessarily see that way, because Star Wars is an inherently emotional experience, and so everyone's rankings are going to be emotion based, and that's okay too. But for me, it's number 3, and then from there we get to the next best movie of the original trilogy, which is Empire Strikes Back, which is sort of a weird one for me. I feel like I have a weird relationship with Empire Strikes Back. Maybe it's just middle points in series. They're hard. I don't love Goblet of Fire either. So maybe that's what it is. Or Princess Azkaban is also like, I think is like good, but not my favorite.
You're just wrong on that one.
I do not think Prisoner of Azkaban is the best Harry Potter book. I will stand by that. It's clearly
I'm sorry. I'm referring to specifically the movie, but okay.
Oh yeah. Oh, the movie, I mean, probably, yeah, that's probably pretty easy. But Empire Strikes Back, I think, is the second best Star Wars movie. So, that's damning it with faint praise over here. It's still phenomenal. I think it just is everything A New Hope was, but better, right? I think the original trilogy builds and evolves really well, which is obviously how you're going to see them in my rankings here in a minute. I think each one builds off the other one. I think it takes the emotional weight from each one and kind of keeps strengthening that. I think it strengthens the characters out. And I think, the core thing in the original trilogy is Luke's journey, right? And his kind of flirtation with the dark side. And you see that reflected in, obviously, the outfits he's wearing, going from like all white to a gray here to black in Return of the Jedi. And I think what this movie does is sort of a minor miracle in its own right for George Lucas to kind of have, arguably hit lightning in a bottle again with a movie that is just as good, if not better, than A New Hope. But really, this movie, so much for me, is Luke and Yoda on Dagobah is excellent. It's all to me. It is the heart of the movie. It is brilliantly done. Yoda is a character who could so easily have been bad or cheesy or corny or just not worked really, right? And it would have been really easy to see how that would have happened. It's not even like a stretch of the imagination, and he doesn't, right?
You see it in the documentary when like they have the scenes where like his eyes are just completely off to the wrong direction. It's like, oh yeah, if it had been that, it would not have worked as well.
Yeah, and I think there is this. I think that Mark Hamill is a really great actor, but I think he often doesn't get a lot of credit for that. But I think what he does in this movie, where he's just acting against a puppet for basically his entire movie. Like he is just kind of acting by himself for like all of his scenes. Like whether it's like him in the speeder and a dead pilot in the background, so he's not talking there. Him talking to like, the Tauntaun, so that's another person. Him talking to Yoda for like all of the movie. And then him at the very end where he's just like by himself walking through Bespin until the final fight with Vader. Like he's just acting by himself. And I think he gives a great performance in it, right? Like it is a testament to Mark Hamill's ability and probably Irvin Kershner's directing that like he was able to give the performance he gives. And I understand why people like this movie the best. It's not hard to see why. And yeah, so I think all the Dagobah stuff is great. I think this is a movie that is so emotionally challenging and conflicted. I think it's really delving into, doubts and questions about Luke's journey. And obviously it has what I think is pretty clearly the biggest plot twist in the history of cinema in the Vader. I just don't think anything competes to it genuinely. Certainly not in terms of pop culture impact. And it's great. Again, that could so easily have not worked. But it does. It feels so right in that moment. Like it just clicks so well. I think immediately just like, yeah, like that makes sense in some way. Like it's like this, like you have that reaction like Luke of like, that's impossible. And then immediately kind of start processing that information. Right. And I think it's just really clever. And I think it just works. This is Harrison Ford's best movie in the original trilogy. I think that's pretty obvious to see. Mm-hmm. And I think he would probably agree. I mean, he wanted him to die at this point, and I think that's sort of reflected at times in Return of the Jedi, and also the more diminished role he has in Return of the Jedi. I don't think those are accidents. Right? And so I think Empire Strikes Back is great. Obviously, it doesn't reach the heights of the one movie above it, but it is a phenomenal film. And I think it has a lot of my favorite worlds in the Star Wars series. Like maybe out of any movie, it has my favorite collection of planets that we visit, right? I think Hoth is iconic for obvious reasons. Bespin, iconic. Dagobah, iconic, right? Like these worlds that are just so different and so varied. And out of the original trilogy, it offers you the most in terms of a variety of planets you're going to visit. Because technically, I mean, in A New Hope, you get Tatooine, and you get Yavin 4, and you get the Death Star, right? And in Return of the Jedi, you get Tatooine again, and you get Endor, which you could argue is basically just Yavin 4.
And Dagobah.
Just a little different.
You go back to Dagobah.
And Dagobah, and very briefly Dagobah, yes, 100%, absolutely. Whereas here, these are three very different planets with very different ecosystems, and none of them are Tatooine, and it's really cool to see. Again, this is kind of goes back into like the variety of the galactic nature of Star Wars that I've always really loved, that the series itself seems to have like a weird relationship with at times. I love the aliens. I love the weird shit. This movie doesn't have a lot of aliens in it, unfortunately. Wait, one movie. But it does have a lot of galactic planets in it, and it's really rad. Obviously, that leads into my favorite Star Wars movie, which is Return of the Jedi. It's Episode 6. It is one of my favorite movies of all time, right? It is easily in my like 3 or 4 favorite films ever. I love Return of the Jedi. I have since I was a child. That hasn't changed. One of the things I am most grateful for in my life is the fact that every time I watch it, I fall more in love with it, which is unique among some of my favorite movies, because sometimes you watch them again and they aren't as good, and I think this one just gets better and better in my eyes. Literally to the extent to where, like, you know, when I watched it last year with Shravia, I had like tears coming down my face during like certain scenes, just like, fuck, that was good. That was good, Luke. I think Return of the Jedi is great, right? Like, I think it is a perfect movie for what I wanted the movie to be, right? I think it's super strange. It's very alien. You get a dope... I love the opening sequence of Jabba's palace. I know some people don't, but I love it because it's just weird, and that's rad. I love the weirdness of Star Wars, and you get it in abundance here. I think Endor and the Ewoks works for me. I've never hated the Ewoks. I was a child when I watched a movie. It works for me. I get it. And then, obviously, this movie, I think, is carried by Luke and Vader's emotional dynamic throughout the film, and it works in spades for me. I think the last act of this movie is, like, as close as perfect as a film can be. I think it just, every level works. The space battle, the Endor fight, and the throne room sequence. I think Luke and Vader in the throne room is one of my favorite scenes in any movie. I think it just is so well done, and it pays off so much of the emotional investment you've given these characters. And then, to bring it back to that kind of seed I'd planted earlier, Luke is a weird hero. And I think we don't talk about that enough, right? Like, I think in the midst of Star Wars and in the midst of, you know, pop culture heroes, Luke is kind of just... I think he's largely painted as like, he's a whiny guy from Tatooine. He's not as cool as Han, whatever. But then if they do delve more into him, I think it's still pretty surface level. Whereas I think Luke is a really interesting hero because Luke only ever wins in any like dual confrontation like with another person he's ever in. He only ever wins when he deliberately doesn't attack, when he deliberately doesn't fight, when he refuses to do the thing, right? Like whether it's Last Jedi or whether it's Return of the Jedi, the only time we ever see Luke win a lightsaber duel is when he doesn't fight, right? He explicitly rejects that option. And I think it's so clever. This is where I talk about like George Lucas being really smart, because I love that aspect of Luke. It is one of the things I do like about Last Jedi a lot, is that they bring it back to that echo from Return of the Jedi where he just refuses to fight, right? He is stronger by not fighting than by fighting. It's also why I think the conversation around whether or not he's a better lightsaberist than Ahsoka is stupid. It misses the point of Luke's character. Right? Like, again, those fans maybe are shitty fans. Right? Like, Luke is so, I think, brilliant and is my favorite character in Star Wars. Is one of my favorite characters, period, because he bucks so many of the established ideas of who a hero is. He isn't someone who is a swashbuckling rogue. He isn't someone who's sarcastic. He isn't someone who's cocky. He isn't someone who is even looks like a traditional hero. He's not big and bold and, you know, beautiful. He's a skinny kid with like, you know, a long haircut. I mean, Luke is a hippie, and like that's the thing. And like Luke is a hippie who saves the universe, and like that's kind of cool. He's a hippie pacifist who saves the universe and redeems his dad. And there's really no other franchise in anything that I can think of that mimics that hero's path. Like the closest you could maybe get is like Steve Rogers in Captain America. that is like so explicitly just like a good dude who doesn't want to fight, right? And even there, they're very different, obviously, because Captain Rogers has to be. But right, like Luke is given the opportunity to just not fight, and I think it makes it so well. And I think a lot of the reasons people misunderstand this character, right, where people identified with Han more, is because Han should be the hero in a lot of the stories of Star Wars, right? Like that is what a hero looks like. That is a hero, right? It is the pirate, it's the cowboy, it's the gunslinger. That's a hero, not this scrawny farm boy who's whining for the entire first movie, right? And so I think Return of the Jedi is really smart about that. I think it's really clever in doing that and committing to that, because it would have been really easy to just have Luke get to the end of Jedi, chop off Vader's arm, and then turn around and like fucking slice Palpatine in half. I win! The Empire saved! It's great, right? But like, it doesn't do that, even though that is what a hero would do. That's what a hero should do, even. And Luke refuses to accept that option, right? Like, Luke is the person in the entire series, the only one really who seems to understand the idea of like, I find it funny that people found Ahsoka or Kylo Ren so interesting about the idea of like, I'm going to forge a third path. Luke did it, right? Like, he is the one who refuses the advice of Yoda and Obi-Wan to kill Vader. Vader can't be redeemed. You have to kill him. He's bad. This is what the Jedi have to do. And he also doesn't go to the dark side and want to just be evil, right? He's like, well, there's got to be a middle ground here. These each seem pretty extreme, right? Like, he recognizes the contradiction of Obi-Wan Kenobi's statement of like, only the Sith deal in absolutes. And he says, well, hang on, that doesn't sound right either. And I think there's just so much complexity and like philosophical like layers in Luke's performance in Return of the Jedi, right? Like, he is hope, and he does it through both actively doing things and also understanding that sometimes in order to, win, you have to not do something, right? That you can get carried away, like Mace Windu did, to Cameron's point, in Revenge of the Sith, and maybe he went too far, right? Maybe Yoda went too far, maybe the Jedi went too far, and Luke says, let's break out of this, dichotomy we only have. These two things are it, and do something different. It's part of why I don't love what they did with him and Last Jedi at the same time, when they then kind of fell back into just doing, but that's a whole other topic. Right, and so I think Luke is really great. I think it's one of my favorite portrayals of a character is Luke in Return of the Jedi, because there's just really nothing like Luke Skywalker, right? And like, I hope if we see more of him in The Mandalorian, spoiler alert, I hope we see that version of Luke, right? I hope we see Luke who is, trying to do something different and understand, and like, they keep that spirit of the character alive, because I think that's what gives Return of the Jedi so much power to it, right? And then the last thing I would say about the movie is, like we touched on, I think it's beautiful, and I think it's a great ending. I think it is a perfect ending to Star Wars, which is still why I'm always like, oh, don't do a sequel trilogy if you're going to do this. And they did it anyway, but it's like, fine. It's still how I think Star Wars ends, and then we just get a new, interpretation of it that's ending. And yeah, so I think I like Return of the Jedi a lot. Obviously, I love the movie. I think it is sort of the black sheep of the original trilogy in some ways. And partially that might be because it does do different things with the characters, and it does give you like a non-traditional ending in some ways. And because it felt like, some of the cast was burnt out on it, right? Certainly Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford were like done with it. I think Mark Hamill gave it his all, and it's great, and I think you see that in his performance. But yeah, I love Return of the Jedi. It would be my pick for the greatest Star Wars film.
Bringing it back around to the James Bond comparison, in the same behind the scenes for the Mandalorian episode that that the whole Ahsoka Luke debate has kind of stemmed from, Mark Hamill in the interview is talking about how he would talk to George, after Return of the Jedi, and be like, it's kind of weird that, like, now that Luke finally has like his full powers, that like we're not going to see any more stories from him. And he draws the comparison to like, it'd be like if you made 3 movies about James Bond getting his license to kill and then stopped making 007 movies. And I was like, Luke really needs to watch The Mandalorian, or Logan really needs to watch The Mandalorian and then watch this behind the scenes thing.
I think I think it's, again, I think it ties back into, right, like I would say it's because we got his journey, right? Like we know who that character will be from that point onwards. And the path that he's going to try to follow, right? And he can stumble and fall. That's allowed. He's human. But that's the route he's going to try to take. And I love that. And I love the idea that, you know, the way the galaxy is saved isn't in a, you know, civil war like in the Clone Wars. It's not through murdering someone. It's not through, you know, destroying up a base or a Death Star or any of this stuff. The way the galaxy is saved is because one person chooses not to do something, right? They choose to put their faith, again, going back to Rey and Lost Dragon, they choose to put their faith in another person. And that small act has enormous repercussions. And I love that. I think it's really beautiful. And I think it is a reminder that in crafting Star Wars, George Lucas also was very influenced by, you know, Eastern like religions and philosophies that are much more pacifist based than a lot of Western ones, which isn't hard to do, obviously. Shout out to the Crusades. And so, you know, I think you see that in this, right? This idea of just to choose non-violence, right? And so I love that. I also love the idea that, again, it is historically accurate. You see a lot more revolutions succeed either non-violence than violent means. And I think it speaks true to the character of Luke Skywalker, a kid who, you know, I think it's easy to forget, came into this saga through traumatic circumstances, with the literal murder of his aunt and uncle, who had spent his entire life, literally from like when he was a day old to now. And they're murdered, right? And he gets thrust into this world. He goes and experiences enormous trauma along the way. He loses an arm or loses a hand, discovers his father's, you know, a mass murdering like Nazi, basically, the face of evil, right? And keeps getting knocked around, keeps getting pushed around, loses his mentor. His second mentor, you know, dies as well for him and Yoda in this movie, which is a beautiful scene. And just keeps getting thrown around. And I think when people talk about the Star Wars movies, Luke is 23 years old when this movie takes place. He's 23. Like, he's still, like, the entire original trilogy takes place in a 4-year span from when he is 19 to 23. He's so young, he experiences the ravages of war in their, like, entirety, right? And how much the brutality of that, right? And so I find it even more powerful that he then chooses to not give in like his dad did, right? Or even, right, like his, you know, I'm going to call him his godfather, like Obi-Wan did in a lot of ways. Or the Jedi did his order, right? That he can, despite all the trauma he's endured, see that any more violence is just going to continue the cycle of violence. Almost like an echo of a Hamilton line. We're just everything's referenced here.
It did, and so I love that he does kill probably hundreds of thousands of people on the original Death Star, though. So he has a pretty good body count himself.
No, but I think, you know, there is. I like the idea that he does it through this different way. That again, like I said, like I can't think of any protagonist character in like any other story that is like Luke Skywalker, because I think a lot of people learned he's a hard protagonist to like market, because he's just like a skinny kid from the Midwest, basically. You know what I mean? And it's like, I think Luke is cool because he ultimately never loses that like kind of wide-eye farm boy looking out at the stars in him. And that's the element I like.
Yeah, when you mentioned that earlier, the closest analog I would pull for you, and I think it tracks pretty well, would be Wesley from The Princess Bride. Yeah,
okay, that's a great one. You know, I like that a lot, Trevor.
Farmhand,
a very different take, but yeah.
has those moments where he picks up these skills. Obviously, is a very adept sword fighter, but at the end of the day, doesn't kill the Count at the end, and does he does act, and whether that's because he can't physically or not, is I think still it is a more pacifist ending as a result. So
that's a great shout out. I like that a lot.
So with your list ranked, let's kind of wrap up with just thoughts on spending the summer with Star Wars in general. I'll kick this off. It was definitely fun from like just a planning and production perspective to not have to worry about what are we going to talk about next week, having that every week mapped out for 3 months. It was like, okay, I'm going to take my time on the weekend, and I'm going to sit down and watch the thing, and I'm going to start working on the document to pull all the fun facts and all the trivia stuff together. And then throughout the week, I'll throw it on like one more time. So I was mostly watching these movies like twice each week, just so they were like, so I got it out of the way and didn't forget about it, and then would have it like fresh in my memory when we got closer to sitting down and recording the show. But then like on top of that, I was also watching The Bad Batch all summer long. So like I was getting inundated with other, Star Wars aspects. I talked about on the Empire of Dreams episode. I also happened to watch the Behind the Attraction on Star Tours, like that day as well. So like there's like a bunch of Star Wars content out there that I was sitting down and engaging with. So with Logan's lists all wrapped up, we were originally going to dive into like thoughts on spending the entire summer with Star Wars, but we've had Discord crash on us 3 times, so I'm kind of tired of that. So like let's just try and like rush through maybe that sentiment and then outro this episode. So Logan, what was your thoughts sitting there with having kind of Star Wars as like our Disney Plus saga for the last 3 months?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on it on a production level. It's been nice to obviously have known what we're going to do for D Plus for 13 episodes in a row. And I think in a similar vein, having like a weekly thing, right? Like having like a weekly meetup with like friends to talk about the thing that you're all watching has been kind of cool as well. Not just on a production level, but like on a communal level. And so I've enjoyed that nature of it, right? Like sitting down with me, you, Cam, and Frank, all just kind of talking about Star Wars and the things we like and don't like about a given movie, or about the characters and the impact they've had on us and the importance of them, the things we don't like, the characters we don't like. It's actually been its own kind of fun version of like film therapy for like 13 weeks. So like I really enjoyed that aspect of it in terms of like that long commitment. And then I think like all of us do, if you do 13 podcasts over for something, we love Star Wars. And so it's been cool to talk about this thing that we are all fans of and do all enjoy, to kind of get to revisit the highs and the lows, and a lot of the middle stuff has been really unique, right? Like you did it while watching Bad Batch. I'm doing it while ending it now and starting to play Fallen Order finally, because I just have that Star Wars itch in me. And so, it is a universe that I love, right? It is a series of characters that I do really enjoy. And I think I said it off mic with you yesterday, but like, I like the fact that George Lucas has just created this, these series of toys for us to all play with and do our own things on and take our own inspirations from, and allowed us the ability to just go anywhere and do anything with these characters and with these worlds. Right? Because like, Star Wars isn't just these 12 movies and a documentary. It's so much more. It's the enormity of it can be overwhelming. There are so many books and so many comics and a lot of movies, and a lot of TV show episodes. And so and a lot of video games. And so I think that's another thing too, is that the one thing I want people to take away is the same thing I've said for years now, which is that if there's something you don't like in Star Wars, I guarantee you there's probably something that you do love, right? And like focus on the things you like, right? If you don't like a particular era or characters, then don't do stuff with those characters in the era, right? Like stay away from the prequels if you don't like the prequels. Stay away from the sequels if you don't like the sequels. If you don't like the original trilogy, that's strange, but I guess don't go over there, right? Like, I think for me, it is a thing of just doing the things and hang out with the characters that you want to hang out with and you want to do things with. And so that's what I would say.
Well, after like 4 failed Discord attempts, we're just gonna kind of call the show there. This has been a nightmarish attempt at a podcast, but good. It's been a fun culmination of talking Star Wars with you, Logan. I wish it had been a smoother day of attempting to record this. At the same point, if these issues had happened like in the actual Empire of Dreams episode, I probably would have also just like closed down the entire website and just been like, fuck this, that's it, that nerdy site is done. But we're done. We've wrapped up our summer of Star Wars. This epilogue is at its end. That is going to do it for this episode of That Nerdy Site Show. Thank you for joining me for when we were able to connect and actually understand and hear one another there, Logan. You follow Logan at Lefty Logie. Anything you would give a shout out to there, Logan?
I would just give a shout out to the YouTube channel, all the different Let's Plays that Trevor's got up there, as well as all the different playlists.
Cool. You can follow me at Trevor J. Starkey. I will echo that. If you missed any of our Summer of Star Wars because you don't listen to that podcast or that D Plus Show podcast, go check that out. It's fun deep dives into a myriad of Disney Plus offerings, and occasionally we do very themed sequences like 3 months talking about every Star Wars movie. So yeah, go check that out as well. Once again, if you liked what you heard, please rate, review, like, subscribe, share the podcast with your friends. And if you don't already support us, you can consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thatnerdysite, where every patron gets early access to episodes just like this one that will go live to the general public a month afterwards. But you can get it early if you support us at $1 or more on Patreon. So thank you for listening. Stay nerdy, be good to each other, and for one final time, may the Force be with you.